Start the recording. Welcome everybody to our series of lectures of ethical implication of AI. My name is Roberto Zicari, and this is our last lecture. It's been an incredible journey, incredible lectures until now, incredible attendees. And our last lecture is from Dr. Estella Hebert from the Goethe University of Frankfurt, our university, but she works in a different department on educational science. And you will see that her presentation will address the ethical aspects from another perspective, which is really the educational perspective. So, Estella, the floor is on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And thank you for inviting me to give this lecture in the first place. I hope that after listening to many of the really interesting and amazing inputs that I can maybe add something from an educational perspective that might be thought-provoking or might be just give some interesting inputs really into critically thinking about the use of AI. Now, in order to go through the next, I don't know, not quite 2 hours, I've divided the talk up in 2 different parts, and I was going to start by giving some first preliminary thoughts on educational theory in itself and some of the challenges of education, and then look at some more explicit examples of ethical challenges for the use of AI in education in the second part in relation to some fundamental topics that are inherent to the educational sciences. So to start off with, I was reading up on quite a lot of articles in relation to kind of the power of AI for education, and one of the titles was Unleashing the Power of AI. And in a lot of the articles that you can find from, especially from kind of economic side, you can read that AI will transform education. It will have a huge impact on education. The way teachers teach and students learn is going to be changed. So there's this kind of very huge promise in relation to AI and education. And I want to start with some kind of maybe historical observations from a media educational perspective, which is my subdiscipline actually within educational sciences, is media education. And with the idea that kind of pulp fiction, and I don't mean Quentin Tarantino's film here, I mean kind of bad literature, was also seen as a threat to female morals when the novel first came about. So in the 17th and 18th century, with the introduction of book print and the novel becoming popular, there was a huge fear that actually particularly female minds would be kind of demoralized through reading books. If we look at it from our perspective nowadays, I guess we would be happy a lot of the time if young people would start to read novels. And so we can see that whenever there is a kind of new medium or a new technology that kind of comes into society and also into education, there are 2 different perspectives that quite often come about. As we can see with what I first said about AI and kind of unleashing its power and completely transforming education, there's this very celebratory, kind of almost utopian perspective on new technologies or new media for education. And on the other hand, especially a lot of the times from within educational practitioners, there is also what we can see like a kind of very conservative dystopian perspective, which kind of think that any new technology or any new medium could be regarded as a threat to whatever it is that we currently have, to the status quo. And we can see those educational revolutions in relation to technology, not just with the introduction of the novel. We can also see it particularly well with the introduction of television in the 50s and 60s, where it was said that television was going to completely transform education. And we can see a kind of same narrative also in relation to the internet that was going to completely transform how education works. And I think while both the maybe dystopian and utopian, or the kind of very celebratory and the kind of very negative perspective on what this might be, are maybe a little bit short-sighted. And actually what we try to do from a media educational perspective is maybe an in-betweenness between a kind of just one-sided celebration or one-sided perspective of threat of these new technologies, and to carefully actually look at how education is being transformed through new media or new digital technologies, and then try to contextualize this. And I think this is where also what I'm trying to show goes again very nicely together with what Roberto was saying in one of his lectures about AI always being part of an ecosystem. And so you can not only look at the AI in itself, but you kind of need to look at the whole context in order to be really able to say how it is transforming or changing, or which ethical challenges are arising through the use of these AIs. And that's something that I would like to second very much, and where I would also like to start as a, just as a thought and as a kind of historical background into saying that I think neither a complete celebratory perspective nor a completely conservative perspective might be the correct thing. And we want to dive a bit deeper and actually look at what is happening in relation to this. Now, educational sciences, which is where I'm coming from, I also wanted to give just a slight background, because I'm not sure where, how much the people listening now know about this, but educational sciences and also pedagogy is an academic field that is kind of engages with theory and practice of education in different contexts through the lifespan. It mainly, of course, often covers children and adolescents within school contexts, but also in non-informal learning contexts. But at the very same time, it also deals with educational contexts throughout life, such words as lifelong learning, and even gerontological perspectives are also within the educational sciences. The way that Roberto and I actually met was through the Ethics Commission, which I am a member of. So our department has an ethics commission where we basically look at different proposals for research ethics within the educational sciences. And I think this commission can maybe demonstrate to you very nicely of the kind of broadness of contexts that are being researched within the department. And with that broadness, also the broadness of kind of maybe ethical implications, but also the broadness of possibilities in which AI can kind of come into educational fields. So what I will be talking about most in this talk is, of course, AI within a school context and within a kind of very traditional institutionalized sense of education. But sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. What I think, and I just want to mark here, is that when it comes to doing research with children, there's kind of a different set of maybe principles that apply. So children could in some ways always be regarded as a vulnerable group as such, because of the fact that they don't have the age of majority yet, and therefore are subjected to different forms of control, to lesser forms of participation in a lot of ways. And thus, when you do research with children, just from a very practical perspective, there are some things that you have to consider before doing it. You need to get consent from the parents, but should you also be obliged to also ask the children for consent, even though legally it might not be necessary, you would definitely say, yeah, you also have to ask the children to consent to the research they're doing. You need to find maybe different ways of communicating depending on the age of the child. And thus, the children themselves are an interesting group to do research with. On the other kind of side of life, rather than those just starting with life, you can also see that those seniors that are old, a lot of my colleagues do research from a kind of gerontological perspective. And there again, you quite often have to deal with quite vulnerable groups. So what does research actually mean when you're dealing with people that suffer from dementia, for example, is a question. How does consent unfold and play out when you're dealing with people that suffer from dementia? I think also raises another example where some of the principles that you might kind of usually use in research cannot apply, and you need to think differently, and you need to kind of apply to different sets of morals also and ethical standards. I went to a really interesting conference on ethical questions in relation to AI and gerontology, actually. And there it was much debated, the use of, for example, I don't know if you know these seals that are little robots that are given to old people and they can stroke them and the seals kind of react. They're these white little like toys essentially that are supposed to make people, old people that often suffer from loneliness as well, feel less lonely. And when you deal with people that suffer from dementia, the question of maybe deceit becomes a different one. The question of how are you able to use these different technologies within these contexts, and where can we get informed consent and where is it not possible? And just because we cannot maybe get informed consent, then what happens? Very interesting questions, actually. A lot of my colleagues also do research with other groups that you maybe could regard as more vulnerable within society. So one of my colleagues is actually in the commission of kind of handling people that have experienced sexual abuse, and they're reworking through these kind of notions of sexual abuse. And a lot of research they do there is with people that have suffered sexual abuse. So again, the kind of ethical implications of doing research with vulnerable groups are very different than it would be in other contexts. So just to give a short background maybe of the kind of broadness of the field of educational sciences as such, and the broadness of maybe also critical thoughts that we have to be aware of when dealing in these very different contexts. Now, one last point to give a kind of background on the playing field of education that I want to raise is that we can actually also see a transformation of education in relation to the fact that it is a growing field of interest and economization. So a growing field of interest to who? Particularly also to economic companies. And I think there we can see a change over the years from education being maybe not as much a sector in which a profit was searched and found. And now we're in a time where we can see that the educational sector as such is really increasing in its economic value. And by that, we can see institutionalized education in schools as much as tutoring and kind of add-ons to these educational contexts in general. So it's a huge field, and this actually also applies very much to the use and development of questions of digital technology and artificial intelligence. So from these companies, education is a kind of more and more attractive field to experiment in and to kind of go into. And I think this is a very important point also that I just want to keep in the back of our minds as we go through looking at some of the contexts that we might be looking at in the long run. Now, as a last point before kind of moving on, I want to give a kind of basic understanding of what assumption of the human being I will be giving this presentation with. And I'm quoting Swartz and his colleagues, and I translated this quote actually, where they say the following positioning assumes the human to be an agent equipped with a free will, living in a community requiring cooperation and setting decision impulses. Freedom and an openness for the future are regarded as essential. So I think the first point that's really important to stress is that in what I will be saying, I do assume that the human being has something as a free will. Now, I'm not a philosopher, and I know there are very different perspectives on this topic, but in what I will be saying, I take as a basic principle that there is something that we can call a free will. And it is because of that that kind of very simple cause and effect models are maybe not really suited always in the best way for didactical considerations. because how the human works is not just a simple cause and effect. At the same time, one of the points that I also want to stress very much is that kind of freedom and an openness for the future are regarded as essential. So both the learner and the teacher are always facing an unknown future. And I think this is very important when we consider questions of open-endedness and the way in which different interpretations can be done. And I think this kind of mirrors in a lot of ways also some points that were stated previously in this lecture. Roberta was saying something about the value of democracy, and should it be important that democracy is also regarded as something that we kind of base a critical analysis on. And I think equally in some ways we could ask, what are the ideas of the human now, not of the collective, but education is quite often interested in the individual and the learning process of the individual, even though that might take place in kind of social contexts. Of course, the learning itself is kind of the learning of the individual. And thus we can equally ask not just about democracy, but also what kind of idea of the human and what kind of perspective of how the human works, and what moral obligations about the human and for the human maybe are at the basis of technologies that are being developed. I think this is a very important point that I just also want to stress here. Now, I thought about how can I maybe metaphorically bring this together now before kind of finishing off the first part. And I picked a kind of map where you're trying to get from one point to the next. And now with digital technology and AI, it is possible for us to be given the fastest route from point A to point B. Now, I want to metaphorically use this as trying to get in education from one point to learning, through learning to another point, where an individual might be changed through what they've learned. Now, the teacher could say, all right, this route, the blue route you can see on the map is actually the best route to get there. The student, however, at any point might also decide, oh no, I'm taking a different route. The system might give you 2 other routes that are equally almost as long, but the student itself could actually go off on a different street at any point. And that's kind of that assumption of the free will and being able to at any point actually not adhering to what is suggested to me, but going a different way. And thus, as long as I get from one point to the next point, maybe it doesn't really matter so much how long it has taken or which route an individual was going. When we would kind of look at an educational process in that way, I also think it becomes apparent of how AI works in education when it comes to individualizing learning processes. So if we take this metaphor of a map, we know that when we are in traffic and traffic changes, a route might always change in real time to give us the best possibility of getting somewhere. And I think metaphorically, this is also how personalized learning analytics also tries to give each individual at any point the personalized best way of trying to get from one place to the next. But I wanted to state that, of course, this is a personalization here is still always within the kind of frames and the principles that have been set within the system that we're looking at. So I think that kind of wording also should be critically questioned of whether we're actually talking about individualized learning or whether it's just extremely finely classified into very different categories type of learning that is taking place. And with this, I'm gonna go to a very first round of questions just to break it up a little bit before I'm going into the second part.
Thank you, Estella, for the very interesting first part. There are a couple of comments and questions that I like to mention. There was a comment by me saying education in some cases is a business, but education is a social good to be shared to everybody. And then Martinez and Cooper mentioned this question: if education is meant to improve society, life quality, and grand opportunity, should it really be seen as a business? Isn't the concept of a profit enterprise by definition at odds with the concept of providing equal chances?
Yes, I mean, I would fully agree with this. And I think actually, if you look at very different educational contexts from schools to university, we can see a shift though into a kind of what, I mean, we would call a kind of neoliberal, maybe structure of, I think even in academia, you can see this shift. And I think there are problems, related to this in relation to questions of equality, in relation to questions of what should education actually be. And I also think it shouldn't be a business model that kind of is set out for profit. Yeah, I can only agree with this, actually.
Thank you. Then Yvonne, who's a lawyer by background, by the way, is asking, I personally feel that the many video online conferences I must attend these days are very deficitary as opposed to face-to-face meetings. Isn't the same true for AI in education? For smart machine which try to teach me something or correct my learning?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I definitely would also second that there is something missing in what is currently happening. And I think in educational context, in the way in which both AI or any digital technology was ever thought to be used, at least from an educational perspective, is not actually as a kind of taking over completely, but in forms of like as an add-on or in forms of blended learning where they come together. But it's not going to substitute kind of the presence and teachers in general. I think this is also something you will be able to find, is that AI in most of the research is not supposed to actually substitute the teacher. It's just supposed to kind of take on some tasks in order for the teacher to be freed up then to have time for other things.
Thank you. There is a question that is from me, and there is a comment from Yvonne. So I'm combining the two because I think you like it. So I was referring to your visualization of the map where you start from a point to get to a target point, and there are different paths. And I was asking, is it more important in education to reach the target point or the path I took? And one make a comment and say, eventually, we should not call the option to take different paths in learning free will. AI can also explore its entire search space. It doesn't need to take the fastest way to learn the optimum.
So, sorry, can you just repeat the first point? Oh yeah, it is about getting somewhere. Now I think within education, and this is something that I will get to also in the second part a bit more, hopefully, there are kind of different objectives a lot of the time. There are some things you would want a child to learn that are essentially literally going from A to B, and whether you take a bit longer or not maybe doesn't matter so much, but you have kind of a very clearly set aim. Let's take maybe math as an example. I mean, you would want the child at some point to understand that 1 and 1 is 2, and you cannot say that 1 and 1 is 3. And that differs maybe very much in some ways from different forms of learning that are also education. I mean, I experience this in educational sciences a lot of the time, and this is why I like coming together with people from different disciplines so much as well. Because the subject that I study, there quite often is no wrong or right answer. It's always a kind of coming together and discussing things from different perspectives and being aware of one's own perspectivity and discursivity. But a lot of the time, it's not a very exact science maybe. And a lot of students that start studying want us to know, oh, what exactly is education? And then all we can answer is, well, you can take this theory and look at education, or you can take this other theory and look at education and try to conceptualize something. But there is no such thing as education. There are only different ways of trying to conceptualize and theorize education. And so I think there are very different things that we might call knowledge or learning or education. And therefore, I think yeah, sometimes there is a set aim, like in the Google Maps, and sometimes also there can't be. And I think it's important that all of this exists, and all of this is considered. Kind of designing AI for education, or digital technologies for education, or analog forms of education.
Thank you. So we let you continue.
Thank you. I'm just going to take one more sip of water. All right, so I'm going to start with the second part now, where I'm going to try to give some more maybe explicit examples of ethical challenges for the use of AI in education, alongside 4 different categories, which are first, transparency, secondly, control and autonomy, thirdly, inclusion and exclusion, and then fourthly, skepticism, certainty, representation. So to start off with transparency, I think transparency actually is a very important point when we look at the questions of AI or digital technologies in general. And I want to start by actually being transparent myself within this lecture for a second, which is that, and I already stated this shortly at the start, after listening to a lot of the other lectures, I felt kind of a little scared. And I felt like, oh, I'm going to have to do something quite good, because all of these lectures were really interesting and really great. And then I wanted to find a perfect example of an AI that is used within educational contexts. And I thought, I'm just going to find really one good example, and then alongside that example show a lot of different points. And I completely failed, because and now I'm not an IT specialist, but it's really difficult to kind of, it was impossible essentially to find one example that really highlighted nicely the different interesting aspects that I thought can kind of come out of talking about this topic. And secondly, it was very difficult for me, and maybe this is something to think about, because I'm not an IT specialist, to sometimes know with a lot of the digital technologies used, whether some of them actually had AI-based aspects to it, whether they were actually coded by human beings as such or not. These are things that to me were very intransparent, and thus I realized that, and you will notice this in the talk, that sometimes I talk of digital technologies in general and not just AI, because actually I'm not qualified, or maybe it's not even possible for anyone to talk to really know what's behind all of this. Now, the first thing I wanted to show is that I found quite a lot of research on this very interesting project called Untitled, which describes itself on the Twitter platform as a European Commission co-funded research project to enable human tutor-like support for learners as an add-on feature for e-learning systems. Yeah, there were a lot of articles from different perspectives also published, but when you go on the website intuitel.eu, the website doesn't actually exist anymore. What I was offered was pizza and credit scores, but I couldn't actually find the project itself. And the last Twitter post was from 2015, which is also when I assume that what happened here is that actually the funding finished, and thus the research project, because it was an academic research project, and while the ideas were super interesting, the funding finished, and so did the project finished. And I think this is a very important point that we have to consider whenever we talk about digital technologies in general, is that temporality, so time, the moment of time that we're in, plays a really huge role. And digital technologies all change and shift and transform themselves through time. So when we try to look at a certain context, or when we try to elaborate and analyze these ecosystems, maybe, we must also make very explicit which digital technology at what point in time we were looking at in relation to this. And one of the challenges in media education we face when we do these analyses is that there is such a huge acceleration of the development of technologies and AI that make it really hard to kind of follow with research, and then make it even harder to follow with the implementation in education. So education is something that is slow to change on a broad level, and thus there's this kind of discrepancy between the kind of really fast changing technology and the kind of very slow shifting educational processes. One of the examples I want to use, though, because I couldn't use Untitled, was to use something called Class Dojo, which is essentially something like a social media app for classrooms. Class Dojo is an American-based firm that claims that 95% of US schools are already using Class Dojo to engage kids and connect with the families. And so one of the features that I think as a trade-off, as a positive thing, actually is really interesting is that within Class Dojo, you can translate messages into 30+ languages. And I have a lot of colleagues that do a lot of research on education and migration. And one of the problems that is often found here is that children that have migration backgrounds often struggle to engage, and their parents even more so often struggle to engage in education, also because of a lack of proficiency in the language of the country they're in the educational system in. And thus there's some research that states that maybe rather than only kind of trying to improve the language, it would also be good if children that are not so proficient can still participate in the content of the education within their first language, so to not kind of track behind, and then they will learn the language of the country they live in kind of along the way. And I think this is actually something where digital technologies and kind of AI of being able to translate really well nowadays could be an improvement for educational contexts. Within Class Dojo, yeah, I kind of painted, this is what it almost looks like. The teachers, the parents, and the students all can create accounts. And then the teacher can reward points or take away points for certain behavior of the students. So the teachers kind of have to decide if they want to do those rewards of the points publicly for everyone to see, or if they want to do that only for the individual children to see. It is the case, though, that the parents get notified immediately when these points are given or not given. The teachers can also take pictures in class and send them to the parents. But we can see already here that actually questions of inequality, I think, show, because what we see in education also is that some parents are very engaged in the child's education, talk to the teacher a lot, are really supportive, and some parents don't do that. And so I think actually in some ways this might also reinforce those already pre-existing kind of inequalities that were there. Maybe to summarize a little bit, some of the challenges in relation to transparency are, first of all, what platform is being used? How is this platform funded? How and by who is it produced? How does it collect data, and are there privacy concerns? Can these questions ever be answered even properly by, let's say, the individual teacher or the school? And as a teacher within my class setting, I must also ask myself, maybe, am I making the marking and scoring transparent? I think it's very important as a teacher that it's made transparent how different marks are being given to the students, so that they can really understand and don't feel like it's just a kind of random and unjust thing that is happening. Am I making the scoring public within the class settings? And can the students kind of constantly see how many points the other students have? That of course increases the level of competitiveness, which can be motivating, but which can also be threatening. And what are the consequences of either of these decisions? So a lot of the time as a teacher, it's actually really hard to take these decisions. Now, maybe I want to make one point before going to that last question, which is Class Dojo itself is free at the moment, and it's kind of funded through different investors mainly from the Silicon Valley and advertising. They are also trying to make money and plan to kind of start premium features that they're developing that schools and parents can kind of pay for. Now already we can of course see that the moment these premium features kind of are added, inequalities in relation to who's able to afford these premium features straight away kind of come in with it too. And Ben Williamson and Alistair Rutherford have written a quite interesting post in which they kind of criticize that the kind of funding structure of Class Dojo, because they're saying that actually Class Dojo is open to the potential of a change of control and could kind of make an attractive acquisition for the sake of kind of potential of monetization, something that we've already shortly discussed now. And Class Dojo, it's not a state-funded application. It's used around the world, and it is a private company that, of course, at some point could always be sold. And then suddenly there you have this huge amount of data of lots of children and parents and teachers. And thus, I do think indeed that this kind of marks a kind of attractive acquisition also. Whether or not that is taking place, we obviously can't know yet, but there of course always is that kind of possibility that must be considered, or as a teacher, if you're going to work with a platform like that. Now, if we go back to the kind of marking and scoring the teacher has to make transparent, I don't know, those of you who might have taught before, it's also very hard to teach sometimes, and it's not a very nice thing to give bad grades. It really takes, it's really quite hard sometimes to take these decisions. And so, and especially then when you also have the parents then coming in and complaining in a lot of these school contexts, that kind of want maybe, or that kind of ease that an AI might offer to a teacher by saying that the AI is actually taking over some form of marking and scoring for the students is something that I think is very easily understandable, because then that responsibility of taking certain decisions can just be placed away from myself onto something else. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point, and that leads over to the second kind of basic theme that I want to talk about, because in the moment in which I kind of give the scoring away to something else, I of course also give a moment of control away to something else. Now, control and autonomy are two terms that are very important also to the educational sciences. When the term education itself actually often assumes a situation in which there is an imbalance of control or power between one person to another, where essentially in the educational process, one person that with more control, i.e. the teacher or the parent, is trying to essentially change the other person with less control, that is the child or the pupil, the learner. At the same time, what's interesting is that the person with the more power is trying to really change that person with less power in order to hopefully in the long run make that person more autonomous. So I think that's a very interesting oxymoron, we might even say, or ambivalence within that educational mandate, in the sense of control and and autonomy, where you can see that a person must use their control in educational settings in order to kind of make the other individual hopefully more autonomous in the long run. And AI within this task maybe of the educational mandate comes in and is presented as a kind of functional helper to help that situation, because AI might take some work off my shoulders, it might save the teacher time. The teacher can then maybe individualize learning for the students and give feedback to the students, so that teachers or parents or policy actors even can kind of use their time more flexibly and for better things. The AI in this perspective kind of comes across as this neutral, emancipatory offer that educational actors can kind of engage with and benefit from. And I think this is what AI promises a lot of the time. Now, one of the problems that we can see is that actually there might not necessarily be an increased sense of autonomy and emancipation the moment we start using AI in educational contexts. Actually, on the contrary, we could also say that in a lot of ways it decreases maybe the number of decisions a teacher can take. The AI itself for teachers a lot of the time is like a black box. So a teacher might not necessarily always know how that AI or the digital technology in itself functions. And while it is supposed to increase the autonomy of the teacher, it can also overburden teachers at many points. And I think it's important to remember that AI and data infrastructures and algorithms are not neutral. There's always an assumption of reality already inscribed within them and in the way that they are produced. And I'm going to talk about this a bit later on, a bit more, hopefully. So when we look at the use of AI, we can then say, when is an exercise actually classified as easy or difficult? When is it marked as correct or not correct? If we go back to that Google metaphor, does the way, if I take a different route, is it still correct? Does it deduct points for that or not? There are a lot of different implications that kind of become transferred into this black box and maybe not necessarily are shifted out of the control of the teacher into the control of the digital technology. Which ordering, filtering, and searching functions are working within there, and what is demonstrated in which way and in which order. And our social categories such as gender and other social categories, are they playing a role in the way in which the AI kind of comes to play and materializes within these educational contexts? I think that's, we can see a kind of shift of control that might not necessarily have to be bad all the time, but that is challenging, and that I think needs to be observed from an academic point of view and autonomy. Because a lot of things might not be controllable anymore, and at some point the teacher and the students run the risk of kind of just suddenly starting to behave towards the AI and the assumptions they have for the AI. And the example that I want to use in relation to this, and I know it's kind of maybe also a bit unjust because I have this outsider's perspective onto the situation in China and the way in which AI is used in classrooms in China. But it's this kind of, from my perspective, almost dystopian perspective of surveillance. And in China, it is the case that in some classrooms and in some schools that every child has this kind of headband on its head that measures the level of concentration of the child. And this level of concentration is constantly kind of being demonstrated in this wave. And as a child now, of course, if I realize that, all right, let's say red means I'm concentrating very well. If I realize a certain behavior I do is kind of giving me a red light, I will, and I want to be very good in class and get the better scores, of course I will adapt my behavior accordingly and try to do that what I think this technology needs in order for me to be concentrating, or at least to give me the data as if I'm concentrating very well. Whether that means I am actually concentrating very well or not, I don't think is what matters in the end. It is what the data shows. At the very same time, the teacher constantly can see all of the concentration levels of all of the class, and also in real time share this with the parents. So the parents in real time already know how their own individual child might have performed on that day in competitiveness to the other students. The teacher, while they're also watching the concentration levels of the class, might also run the risk of kind of just changing their behavior towards that technology that then actually really acts like a medium between the interaction of the students and the teachers, that suddenly don't direct their interaction necessarily at each other anymore, but that direct that interaction also at that kind of technology that stands in the middle. And in a lot of school systems, the teachers are also being more and more surveyed, and their performance is kind of based on the performance of their students. And so, of course, if my performance is based on the performance of my students, I then will also kind of try to really engage them and try to really react to those levels that are being presented in order to also improve my own performance. And I think when we look at contexts like that, they're kind of based very heavily on behavioristic learning models that go away from that kind of image of the human being that I presented at the start. In this more behavioristic model, the human is kind of this emotional and easily manipulable being who kind of really easily reacts to positive reinforcement in the short term, and a kind of calculability and predictability of what my actions might give me in that kind of profit that I immediately want. So instant gratification over kind of long-term planning. And this means that maybe tasks or contexts that are irritating, that require a diversion from the common or calculable, and even things that might be very frustrating might kind of be ruled out in those learning contexts and might be kind of modeled out over time when we look at that. And being substituted with kind of really easily solvable and programmable tasks that offer positive emotions on completion. So there's this kind of stimulus response system that we can also refer to as nudging a lot of the time. I got this image here where people are kind of being nudged into certain direction. And that term of nudging is also used often within moments of gamification, as we can maybe see here. So I'm supposed to jump to the trash bin, and it's gamified in the way that I can do like this child's jump in order to get there and throw my trash away. But the way in which gamification often is included is actually more through functions and logic that adhere to competition, ranking, and reinforcement, rather than maybe giving a true sense of free play with open-endedness and maybe a privilege to kind of just waste time and a privilege of having a space in which for a short while a child might not be surveyed and supervised, in which it might not be graded for a short amount of time, in order to give some kind of freedom also to the child. And with that, maybe also to allow the child a certain sense of autonomy of taking certain decisions more freely, because there isn't that kind of instant penalization if the moment I kind of diverge from the route that maybe it should have been. So I think that it's very interesting in this interdisciplinary context, and this is maybe one of my wishes or hopes, to think of how digital educational platforms or AI can be used within education, and at the same time kind of inscribing a sense of autonomy and open-endedness within these technologies, so that we can really maybe also try to empower the students more and not just turn them into Pavlov's dogs from a behavioristic perspective that kind of get hungry every time the bell rings. And I know this metaphor was maybe meant slightly ironically, but I hope it helps to understand anyway. So I think the question of control and autonomy is very essential, and it's actually difficult for teachers a lot of the time to be able to know exactly how these tools that I might use work. I think as a teacher in society, you can tell that there's a challenge for time and resource, and there are a lot of implicit expectations put on teachers of everything they have to give to the students. And everything they should know and should be doing already, such as using digital technologies, such as being as inclusive as possible. And it's hard sometimes. And so moving on, as I already stated, with all of these different expectations, Oh, sorry, I should read out these questions. So before I move on to the topic of inclusion and exclusion, some of the challenges, and I think I've kind of already stated them, but I'll just read it out one more time. In relation to control and autonomy, where does a shift in control and autonomy for the teacher and the student, and maybe the parent actually also, take place through the use of AI in education? How is the behavior of the teacher, the student, the parent, etc. changed, and which techniques are used for kind of motivating the student or the teacher? Which idea of learning is represented in the design of the digital technology? Is it behavioristic? Is it cognitive? Is it constructive? And can both teacher and student still be regarded as autonomous and free in the way that this technology assumes the human, the student, and the teacher to be? So the next and penultimate topic is the question of inclusion and exclusion, which is a very big topic within the educational sciences, and kind of was started with reference to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. But questions of inclusive education also take place in relation to issues of disability, but also disadvantage, social inequality, diversity, heterogeneity. And from an inclusive educational perspective, a lot of the time the questions are to try to find out which normative ideas underlie certain principles and structures within the educational system, and who is being included and who is being excluded through which principles in which way, in order to kind of develop a context in which efforts for inclusion can become part of the practice. I was playing with a sense of gamification in my lecture, and so I have here the alphabet in Braille, just to kind of highlight this notion of inclusive education. And I think digital technologies, and this should not be forgotten, offer a huge advantage for people with disabilities a lot of the time. There are very many ways in which education can really help in certain contexts, but even there, I think, and this is what we stated earlier already, not as a form of kind of completely taking over, but as a kind of add-on and as an extension to conventional kind of learning contexts, maybe. So when we talk about inclusion and exclusion, I think one important question is also who's included in decision processes at different levels. If I use a certain technology, then who actually can decide autonomously maybe and contradict or refuse at certain points? Is it at the point of the individual student? Can the student say, no, I'm not participating in this? And we know that children quite often are subjected to huge levels of control, and actually a lot of the time don't have the rights to participate in society as much as people that are already majors. Is it the individual teacher? Is it on the level of the whole school? Or is it even on a kind of political governing level? And just a short note, I don't know where most people are coming from, but in Germany, the educational system is actually structured federally. So there are essentially 16 different educational systems within Germany for each federal state. And this is why educational research in the German academic context quite often, I don't know, this is a critical comment on my own discipline, but a lot of the time it's not very international, because actually even within Germany itself, there are so many different perspectives, and you can do so many different comparisons between different federal states, even within here, within Germany. So I think the level of who's included in different decision processes is also an important one. And when we bring together some of these assumptions, we can say, where does the decision process and also the production process come together, and who's included into those processes? Which level is it decided at, and which level is contradiction or refusal possible? What about questions of consent? Now, maybe I'm going to add just a short comment from my perspective, is that a lot of the times when digital technologies are being developed, educational scientists are actually not considered and not included in the production process with their specific knowledge and expertise. And a lot of the times, in the end, I've experienced this on a lot of interdisciplinary conferences, when there are certain problems in relation, especially also to ethical perspectives, the solution is quite often put onto education. So in relation to privacy questions, a lot of the time I heard in conferences people saying, well, people need to gain a critical understanding of privacy questions through education. And so I think there's this kind of disconnect between kind of the level of participation for educational input and the level of responsibility that is placed on it. So if refusal is actually possible at either of these levels, then what does that mean? If a school decides to use a certain technology, then what does that mean if one teacher or a couple of teachers do not want to participate? What does that mean if one student in a class does not want to participate? Then there are certain practical challenges that also arise out of opening up a kind of possibility for contradiction or refusal. The question of inclusion and exclusion, I think, also becomes important in relation to questions of inequality. And I'm going to just mark this in relation to what in media education is referred to as first-level digital divide and second-level digital divide. So the first-level digital divide was, and it goes along with when the internet came, it was kind of seen as this huge possibility to overcome inequality in education, because through the internet, essentially everyone was able to gain information. Now, the first divide, though, that had to be overcome was the question of access. So that's first-level digital divide. In order for everyone to profit from the internet, everyone must have access to the internet through internet connections, through devices, and so on. The question of access nowadays is something that can almost be ignored in some ways, because I think over 90 or about 99% of people, at least of the young ages, have access to the internet. And what becomes much more important is the perspective of the second-level digital divide, which is that now that everyone might have access, or most people have access to the internet, it still happened that inequalities were not actually overcome, but rather reinforced. So what could be seen in research is that a lot of the times, those people that already came from quite highly educational backgrounds use the internet in order to also learn more and improve their knowledge further, whereas people from lower educational backgrounds quite often weren't able to do that. And thus the kind of gap within the educational inequalities actually increased rather than decreased. So how are inequalities increased and decreased? Through the use of certain AI and technology. And I think it's something that's very important to look at when using those AI. I know in previous lectures we have touched on the kind of biases inherent in AI and so on already a little bit before. And I think, yeah, this is a central point for questions of inclusion and exclusion also. I'm going to come to my last input now, which is related to questions of skepticism, certainty, representation. And maybe this is also what to me is one of the most important points. Ben Williamson and Deborah Lupton have written a really interesting article on datafied childhood, and they're demonstrating very nicely of how childhood nowadays is sometimes subjected to forms of datafication, even in utero, that means before they're being born. So through something like a pregnancy app in which a becoming mother can kind of upload ultrasound pictures, information on the baby. There's already a kind of data footprint on a person that's not even born, hasn't even been born into this world yet. Now, through something as baby tracking apps, where I can, by the way, also see if my baby adheres to a certain norm that within the app has been posed. Is the weight all right? Does it eat enough? It's kind of all measuring the kind of baby against normative assumptions of what eating enough even means, what weight a person should have at a certain point within their lives. But even there, in some cases, more data exists. A lot of people post pictures of their children, of their babies online, and thus childhood kind of growing up nowadays enables a person to suddenly have to relate, possibly, to a lot more data points about themselves than was previously the case, than maybe some old photo albums that were somewhere in the basement and got taken out once a year at Christmas or something. Then through learning technologies such as Class Dojo and other applications, more data is being collected about the child. And then as the child goes on, maybe different digital platforms, a lot of information also gets collected about their social and private lives, and they're kind of becoming into a person. And I think that's when you actually look at the ways in which childhood is also being datafied, the question then arises, so what does this data actually mean? Why does it matter? I think the central problem, and I'm going to come to that in a bit even more, is that this data always presents itself to be objective and neutral and true. And this is the main challenge, that we forget that data always also kind of frames is in structures that are also based on certain norms and values. And a lot of the time that kind of gets forgotten. I think skepticism against the background of certainty, so especially when an AI presents a decision that is correct because it came from something technological and not from something human, which is much more subjected to mistakes possibly. It is important to consider that in general there is a degree of doubt and caution and modesty, which in all kinds of scrutiny and decision ought forever to accompany a just reasoner. So I think one of the problems with AI is that the way we talk about AI is quite often heavily anthropomorphized. So when we talk, for example, about machine learning, we use the term learning that we also use for human beings, even though we might not actually be able to compare the way a machine learns to the way a human being learns. They are different things, they are not the same. But by using those same words, it kind of implies that what is happening there is something that also happens within the human mind. And we can see very different examples of this, I think, throughout the words that we use in relation to AI. Now, what we, I think where we are not yet, but I can also be proven wrong at this point, is that as a human being, that kind of skepticism against any knowledge, and this is how research and science has worked forever, is kind of being critical against maybe the assumptions that were part of the status quo, and critically questioning and doubting and cautioning anything actually. And an AI as such is not able maybe to do that in the same way. I haven't experienced anyway examples where an AI was used in a context with the same sense of maybe critical ability to also reflect on its own decisions or its own behavior. And I want to go back to a quote by Susan Sontag, who in her book on photography has kind of given something that I think works very nicely as a metaphor. So Sontag kind of criticizes photography because she says, with the introduction of photography always had this kind of inherent objectivism because it showed reality as it is, rather than the painted picture that was used before. The photograph kind of really showed the truth. And Susan Sontag actually kind of criticizes this notion that kind of comes with the photograph. A photograph is not just the result of an encounter between an event and the photographer. Picture taking is an event in itself, and one with ever more peremptory rights to interfere, to invade, or to ignore whatever is going on. Photography implies that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. But this is the opposite of understanding, which starts from not accepting the world as it looks. All possibility of understanding is rooted in the ability to say no. I think these quotes refer back to a lot of things that I've kind of already stated and problematized here. And I think it shows a way in which maybe that ecosystem metaphor can be brought up again, namely that she states that a photograph is not just something neutral, even in this case, just as the AI is nothing neutral that just kind of is there and can be used functionally or not. It kind of is in an ecosystem, it's placed in an ecosystem, and then it changes something to that system, can interfere, it can evade, and it can ignore. The moment where it ignores is maybe where, as a journalist, I'm taking photographs of a war scene, and I'm not actually helping maybe someone that's being injured within that scene. There are huge of ethical implications that, for example, would rise up in relation to that scenario. And I think these metaphors she uses can be used in a very similar way in relation to digital technology and also AI. So when we use AI or digital technologies in general, what the photograph does, yes, it shows reality in a different way than the picture does, but it also frames. It doesn't show the whole reality. It misses out anything we could smell, anything we could hear. It's also just in visual input. It frames, so the frame is actually just a short part of the whole reality of where that picture was taken. And the photograph itself can never reflect on everything that it leaves out, that it misses. And that goes back immensely to the question of inclusion and exclusion. What is actually being excluded always also needs to be apparent and transparent in order to critically reflect on any technology that we're using. So to go back to that article about data-fied childhood, because what happens is, as Lupton and Williamson argue, learning analytics and adaptive learning platforms make data processing algorithms and predictive analytics technologies into key techniques for the personalization of education, therefore erasing children's own embodied experiences and voices from decision-making processes about their learning. I think the moment in which a child cannot actually experience that their own voices, decision-making processes, that their own subjective experiences are worth something, because the technology that is being used, the AI, always has a truer, more objective information, that's when it suddenly also becomes quite dangerous in relation to what we are presenting to children. And their worth within this world as autonomous beings. And therefore, I think that a reflection on how digital infrastructures in general are being produced is important. And I want to highlight the kind of norms or the social perspectives that are always already inherent by giving this example. And this could be now any social networking site where I'm signing up, and there are certain personal information that I have to give in order to sign up, such as name, email, password, birthday, and gender. And with the example of gender, we can see that some social networking platforms actually offer not just a binary division between female and male, but also offer to customize a gender for those people that might not identify as either female or male. And so there was at some point somewhere in the production of this infrastructure that decided to open up the possibility to identify essentially as neither male or female, but to identify as a gender that is outside of a binary division of these two genders. And I think whether or not one agrees with all of this, that's not the discussion I want to get into, but I just want to show in how far decisions of how we expect the world to be from a social perspective are actually reflected and do kind of get materialized in these platforms. I had a very interesting talk about South Africa, who was saying in South Africa, in order for a child to be when it's born, to be signed up and to become a citizen, someone of the nuclear family must go and sign up the child. So it has to be either the father or the mother. Now, the situation in South Africa, however, is that a lot of the times they have a lot of migrating workers where either the father might not even be known or away, and the mother actually is away, and it is grandparents or aunts and uncles that look after the baby and would have to sign it up but can't. And the mother has to very quickly go back to work somewhere else. And thus, because the kind of infrastructure in which they were collecting the data did not allow for anyone else to sign up those children, there was a huge amount of children that just never were registered from the state side, and then suddenly at the age of 6 all started school. And I think it was like over 1 million or something that 1 year all started school at the same time and had never been registered, and then we're all at these schools. And then suddenly it was clear that these data infrastructures did not actually represent the reality, the social reality of the situation in a lot of these families. And then what does that actually mean? And I think these two examples show, hopefully very nicely, why it is important that we work together interdisciplinarily, so that different expertise can be brought together and create technologies and AIs that kind of don't run against maybe a social reality or educational knowledge. So I only have 3 short questions here, which are: what can be challenged and how? What is being represented? How? What is not being represented at all? And who do I listen to, or who don't I listen to, in relation to all of these arguments that I have just said, and a kind of relation to moments of also being skeptical towards things that I'm seeing, not necessarily critical only from a negative perspective, but skeptical, and not taking any certainty as something too certain maybe, and questioning the forms of representations that are existing in our world. To finish, I'm gonna use one of Roberto's slides that I think goes back to the point of kind of coming together and working together, that I find is very important, and where I find this lecture has been really amazing. And I hope it opened up a lot of different kind of ideas and perspectives to come together, that AI is not a single element. It is not in isolation. It is dependent on the domain where it is deployed. And it is part of one or more digital and not just digital ecosystems. Actually, from a theoretical perspective, when we talk of life, the differentiation between things that are analog and digital quite often is not even upholdable as easily anymore. And AI is part of processes, products, and services, but it is also related to people. And that's where I want to finish and go into maybe a little further of a discussion. Here are some sources that I used, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Estella, for the very interesting presentation. We have a very active participant discussion in the chat, so there's keep the references, because one question is, you mentioned this Chinese example, but you didn't show any source. So how do we find out more information about that?
Actually, I watched a really interesting, this could be, I'll send this along because I don't think it's in the source right here, but I saw a while ago, very interesting, from Wall Street Journal, just a short video on YouTube that I will send the link in the, can I stop my presentation? I'm not sure if I can actually, can you still see? Ooh, sorry, now I stopped it, right? I can send the link into the chat.
Yeah.
quickly.
Also
And it's a very interesting video of a camera team that got access actually to some Chinese schools, where the picture kind of also I copied from.
yeah. If you need to put the presentation back, you can still share it. So Emily has a question. She said, which she's referring to some conversation in the chat, but she said the human bias can be negotiated through dialogue, pluralism, and interaction, which is so important in society. AI is not so conducive for this, which might be the problem with using it in some areas, for example, in education. What do you think?
I'm just finding in, so the question essentially is more problematic because in education, sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
Let me rephrase it for you. I think what she's mentioned is that we were talking about the bias. They are not only, the data is not only biased, but people are biased. And so and she's saying, well, this is actually normally resolved by a negotiation, so a dialogue, multiple views. And when you have AI in the picture, this could maybe avoid all of that. And could it be a problem, for example, in education?
Yes, I think it could be. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It might make some things, and I think I referred to this, it might make some things easier. But of course, it takes away the possibility of negotiating certain things that were negotiable before. And I think it is also a part of education. And that's why it's important that a teacher, whenever he scores or she scores, actually needs to be make those scoring processes transparent also, and needs to be able to defend their decision against questions from any student or parent as to why that mark was given in that particular way. And I think currently, at least I don't know of ways in which AI might be able to also justify their own decisions in the same way. Maybe one day, I don't know, it's imaginable for me that AI could also have very explicit reasons. And then maybe that negotiation would just be transformed into something else.
Thank you. There's a question for Fotis from Greece. And he's referring to e-learning. So, and he said, is any point in talking about inclusion or discrimination when you use e-learning?
Yes, I think when you open up, so what is inclusion? I mean, yeah, on a very general level, and this is maybe the actually the side that a kind of IT perspective side, where yes, inclusion can be very easily defined in a binary system of yes included, no included. So as long as everyone in e-learning, as long as everyone has access, they are definitely included. But from a social perspective, exclusion and inclusion processes exist on many different levels. So just because I have access, let's say, to a certain chat, does not necessarily mean at the same time that let's just use the example of okay, I am a child and I've moved countries and I don't speak the language. Yes, I have a laptop, I can get onto the e-learning system, but I don't actually understand a word that is written there. In that moment, of course, it shows that just the access does not necessarily mean inclusion, because if I can't understand the language now, I'm obviously not included in what's happening there. And so, yes, when an AI can then translate it, I might be included differently, but I think inclusion can be looked at from very different perspectives. And thus it is not just a question of an internet connection.
Thank you. There's a comment question from Emily from France. As you can see, we have attendees from all over the place.
Nice.
Yeah, that's actually the very good thing about this. She said, thank you for highlighting normative standards. This is really at the center of where the challenges are. Assuming that right and wrong desired results are always clear. Would you like to comment on that? She said, she put a question mark, probably asking if you agree.
Yeah, I think this is where one of the huge challenges is from, and coming from maybe coming from the social sciences, that's very obvious to me that that is also where one of the big challenges is based in, because there might be some content where actually right and wrong is very easy. I used the example of math earlier, but there are a lot of aspects of education where we cannot just think in kind of binary systems of right and wrong, and where the desired results are not clear, and it's important to include that as well. And I think this was one of the points I was trying to make, that currently, still as of now, when we analyze some of the technologies that exist within digital technologies that are used, and also AI-based technologies that are used within education, they often run on these kind of behavioristic models that assume a kind of very clear right and wrong. And I would heavily contest that, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe the last question for you, or maybe for the colleagues in your department, do you or did you use any AI in education in your, let's say, department in some real examples?
Oh, do we use AI in our department? Currently,
if somebody has some experience of using AI in some way.
That's where I mean, I can say that I use some AI in just the general things I do, for example, on Google. But to use particularly AI that is developed for educational contexts, I'm currently not using that. I know there is, I think his name is Professor Drexler at the Department of Psychology, who's developing this kind of learning analytics tool that he's also at the Goethe University that he's trying to kind of advertise for. And he states that he's trying to give a kind of humanist approach to learning analytics. But I have never used that actually. But I know in other departments it is being used.
Thank you. I think that this is basically, looking at the chat, all the questions that we have. I'd like to thank you for the interesting and challenging presentation that you didn't really, you could compare it. Yesterday we had a presentation that was more on the technical level, where things are measured with parameters. So you could have 0.7 and equity odds, which only somebody in machine learning will understand. That would be fair. So, so this is really a completely different mindset. So thank you, Estella, for your presentation. And to everybody, this is the last lecture. So thank you, everybody, for attending, for the great interaction. Especially one can see from the chat how qualified our attendees are. The good thing for me is that this was the first time we did it, and I think I'm really excited that it was a very good project for me, and hopefully is also for you. All presentation material, copy of the slides, and video, the recording are available online, because we really believe that education and knowledge should be for everybody. So and that's why we put them online, and feel free to refer to that. And hopefully this is a beginning of a journey. And I would say, Estella, thank you for this very interesting closing lecture, because it kind of really connects to people. So when we've been in school, everybody was in school. Maybe some of us have kids that went to school.
Yeah.
We know what it means. We know what it means. And we also know that a great teacher can be a great motivator. And a bad teacher, I leave you to decide. So everybody, enjoy the rest of the day. And Stella, thank you again for this presentation.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.